Welcome to the Outthinker podcast. Each week, we talk with forward-looking strategists and innovators that are challenging the status quo, leading the future of business, and shaping our world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network.
Right from the beginning, we had access to amazing people to interview, like the head of HR, Donna Morris for Walmart, and the head of the consumer business at Amazon, and people at NASA and the Mayo Clinic and within the military. And when I said, I'm kind of new at this, so help me understand, how do you define a workforce? They said, this is an interesting question. It's changing, right? We've been thinking about this, or we had a meeting about this morning, right? And we got all these different answers. And we realized that the most forward-thinking people were thinking much more holistically. They were realizing that between 30 and 50% of their workforce is often contingent workers.
That was Elizabeth Altman, an associate professor of management at the Manning School of Business at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She's also guest editor of the MIT Sloan Management Review Future of the Workforce Project. She teaches strategy, organizational theory, and human resource management in undergraduate, MBA, and doctoral programs. Elizabeth has spent years researching the areas of strategy, innovation, platform businesses, and ecosystems. And in the highlighted clip, she shows that she's discovered something that I think is a really big idea. It used to be that your workforce was simply composed of employees. But today, 30 to 40% of a company's workforce is often made up by contractors. Add to this the increasing amount of work being done by suppliers and partners, and you see that what composes your workforce is much different than it once was. And that raises a lot of questions. In this episode, we dig into some of those questions. We cover various topics on the subject from her newest book titled Workforce Ecosystems, co-authored with David Kieran, Jeff Schwartz, and Robin Jones. We discuss, amongst other topics, the new role of institutions in society and how workforce, employee, and stakeholder sentiment play into that. The actual definition of a workforce and how it has expanded to include things that we don't normally think of as workforce. How to consider goals and incentives for employees given this broader perspective. How do you build culture when your workforce is composed largely by contractors and suppliers? And even why AI and machine learning technology should now be considered part of your workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Altman. Liz, thank you so much for being here with us. It's great to finally have you on the podcast. I want to open up with the same two questions I ask all our guests. The first is just to get us to know you a little bit personally. Could have nothing to do with your work. If you could complete the sentence for me. If you really know me, you know that.
If you really know me, you would know that in the fall of 2018, I packed up a small, maybe large U-Haul trailer and drove it down to West Point and spent 6 months teaching at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. So if people don't know, that's the college that the U.S. Army uses to train, one of their ways that they train officers. And I taught full-time there for 6 months, teaching cadets. I had 67 cadets. It was a huge honor to be there, and I learned an enormous amount from them and from my colleagues there. The officers there are fantastic, and the cadets also are fully committed to what they're doing. It really opened my eyes to how our military serves, and leading to what we're going to talk about later has allowed me to build great connections and friendships in the military, and I learn a lot from them in terms of how they operate and how they operate as an ecosystem, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But in our book that we'll talk about, we've interviewed both General Beagle and General Clark, both who are fabulous leaders, and they helped us think through some of these ideas in a really meaningful way.
Fascinating. Yes. So many questions that jump out of my mind around that. So I'd be excited to dig into that. And before we get there, I'd like you to answer one more question for me. What's your definition of strategy?
Excellent. So a number of years ago now, when I was just starting to teach strategy, I asked Professor Ramon Casadesus Massanal at Harvard Business School what he was using. And this is a little bit older now, and every year I look for other versions, but I still like this definition as the base. And that is that strategy is an integrated set of choices. And I'll go through it and then I'll tell you why I like it. Integrated set of choices, positioning a firm in an industry to generate superior financial returns over the long run. And part of that you'll catch is a little bit old, But still, the beginning, strategy is an integrated set of choices, is about decision-making, and it's about trade-offs, and it's about figuring out what not to do, which I think most strategy professors would say is essential for a good strategy. The second, positioning a firm in an industry allows us, especially with students, really to talk about this is about competition, it's about markets, it's about figuring out where and how you compete. Generate superior financial returns clearly is important, but I think these days needs to be expanded. And I've had some great conversations with other strategy professors about how we might rewrite this. The notion of contributing more broadly to a community, the notion of doing good, the notion of purposeful strategy isn't encapsulated in this definition, which in itself I find interesting and useful when I'm teaching to say, look, this is the change. The fact that this sounds old to you, even as students, is actually interesting. And then over the long run, of course, is the distinction between strategy being kind of a long run process, thinking long run versus shorter term. And even that I find very interesting because long run is very different for different industries and different people. I was just speaking recently with the Cornell University librarian. She runs an enormous world-class library system. And she said, we think in 500-year increments. And I said, what? What do you mean 500 years? And she said, well, one of the things we do is preserve artifacts, and we need to make sure that they will survive at least 500 years. And so I said, well, I teach strategy and I talk about the long run, but I have to say I don't normally think in 500-year increments. So to me, that's an interesting discussion, talking to different people about what they consider long run.
Maybe that's what Albert Einstein meant. Time is relative. Fascinating. And why do you think it is that that third component feels dated? Why has the focus shifted to things broader than financial performance?
I think, and this ties to other parts of the conversation we can have about worker preferences changing. I think worker preferences, stakeholders of all sorts now think a little bit more broadly about what goals and objectives should be. And institutions more broadly, what the role those institutions play in our society should be. So some it's more clear than others, like a university, for example. But I think these days corporations are thinking much more deliberately and intentionally about their role. And I think their consumers, I know my students, as I talk to them about why they buy what they buy and how they make decisions about what they buy, it makes a difference to them what the position of these companies is. I am continually surprised. I may assign a group presentation about sustainability, for example, and inevitably someone will present about Patagonia. And they make it a real big deal that they understand Patagonia and they choose Patagonia because of some of Patagonia's decisions. So that highlights to me that if I said strategy was only about generating superior financial returns, at least some of them would push back. And some more than others. And it's always interesting to see, of course, which students push back. But by and large, more than I would have probably originally thought will push back and say, why do we think it's only about financial returns? So I think it's a demand-driven maybe change.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And maybe also supply with, you talk about workforce also.
Absolutely. I think workers themselves are thinking long and hard about where they spend their precious hours, and it matters to them.
Great. So again, that's raised a whole bunch of other avenues of discussion. I'd like to frame this conversation, if you don't mind, around your most recent work and some of the work you're most well known for, workforce ecosystems. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you came upon that as a topic of interest?
Sure. So rewind to March 2020. Believe it or not, the first few weeks of March 2020, I received an email from David Kieran at Sloan Management Review saying, would you consider being guest editor for the future of the workforce? We had a conversation about it, and I said, I've done some homework, and I've read the work that you all are doing at Sloan Management Review and Deloitte, which is fabulous, but it's quite focused on inside the company. It's a little bit HR-centric. And I'm not sure if you know, but I study platforms and ecosystems. And I tend to think about companies, relationships with other companies, and organizations' relationship with the outside world, usually via platforms and ecosystems. So I don't think this is a very good match. Maybe I shouldn't be guest editor. And he said, no. He said, we know exactly who you are, and we know exactly what you study. And I think very insightfully said, we think the future of the workforce discussion needs to move to crossing organizational boundaries, to thinking outside. So we don't want to take an internal HR-centric focus. So I said, okay, well, if you're willing to do this a little bit as an experiment and take a real ecosystem platform related lens, then let's try this. And so that's what we did. And we started talking with people about how do you define a workforce? And we found it to be super interesting because right from the beginning, we had access to amazing people to interview, like the head of HR, Donna Morris for Walmart, and the head of the consumer business at Amazon, and people at NASA and the Mayo Clinic and within the military. And when I said, I'm kind of new at this, so help me understand, how do you define a workforce? They said, oh, this is an interesting question. It's changing. Right. Oh, we've been thinking about this, or we had a meeting about this morning, right? And we get all these different answers. And we realized that the most forward-thinking people were thinking much more holistically. They were realizing that between 30 and 50% of their workforce is often contingent workers. So we've had contractors forever, basically, for a very long time. I worked at Motorola for a very long time. We always had very good people working with us who were contractors, but they were probably 5%, maybe 10% of the workforce. These days, we just published a short article about Cisco. Cisco has something north of 80,000 employees and 50,000 plus contingent workers. It's a huge proportion.
Of the 80 or 50 or 80 plus 50?
130 total, but 80 employees and 50 contingent. There are other companies with those types of numbers in our research. You can see them. And so when that's the case, and then you say to leaders, well, our organization does this, or our employees do this, or we've asked our employees this, or our employees prefer this. And then you say, do you mean employees, or do you mean your whole workforce? And then you realize that they're actually often only talking about a very small percentage. And now that I'm starting to see it out in the world, very often investors, consultants, everybody who talks about companies tends to talk about the employee number, which we believe is a slightly misleading way to think about it. Because if you think much more holistically, then you really capture all of those who are involved in contributing to creating value for an organization. And thus, we then, getting back to your initial question, we moved forward and we said, okay, after a good part of this research, why don't we come up with a definition of what we're talking about? As an academic, as a scholar, as a professor, but also someone who tries to spend a lot of time talking to people who are not in academia, we were straddling this challenge of what's a definition that people will understand, but is also rigorous. So I'll say it first and then unpack it again, right? We came up with this definition, which is a structure focused on value creation for an organization that consists of complementarities and interdependencies, which I'll come back to. And the structure encompasses actors from within the organization and beyond, working to pursue both individual and collective goals.
That sounds like a very thoughtfully crafted definition.
There was a lot of fun debate around it. So we call it a structure because it's a governance structure, right? It's not an organization. We thought about alliances, groups. There are lots of different words you can imagine, but we chose the word ecosystem deliberately. So ecosystem is a governance structure. It's focused on value creation because at its heart, this is about creating value for organizations. Consists of complementarities and interdependencies. By complementarities, we mean, for example, when you have an app store and you have developers, they are working independently, so separately, but the work that they're doing benefits the company. So none of us these days have phones that have only software made by Apple or Samsung or Google or whomever. We all have phones, pretty much, that have software that are made for Spotify, for whoever. Right? And so then the question is, traditionally, would you call those developers part of your workforce? The answer is no. But we would say, look, these products aren't interesting, aren't valuable to consumers without these apps. And thus, the work that was done on those apps needs to be taken into account in some way. And so thus, it's part of the workforce ecosystem. So that's where complementarities come in. It's generally work done by independent companies, but together offer value for mutual customers. So in that case, smartphone users. Interdependencies, we mean basically the people and organizations who are involved in a workforce ecosystem either succeed or fail together. So you've got interdependency, meaning you rely on each other to get things done.
Our success, my success is dependent on yours and vice versa.
Exactly. That's what connects us, right? More so than a contract, say, right? We're connected by our interdependency. and our relationship is built on these dependencies. We also say actors from within the organization and beyond. Within the organization is important because we're not dismissing or diminishing the role of employees. And often there are new connections within organizations. We can talk a little about talent marketplaces, new ways of working within an organization that are part of a workforce ecosystem. And then we mention individual and collective goals because it's not sustainable if all the members are only working for collective goals. Every participant has their own goals. Generally, goals may be compensation related, but they also may be different types of fulfillment. They may be trying to build a reputation or portfolio. They may need flexibility for some reason. And that's true of individuals and organizations, right?
That makes a lot of sense. Just reacting to that makes a lot of sense. Like I can imagine, say, in a time of war, that there can be this convening of objectives, right? And maybe in a religious context, but in most contexts, we're naturally going to have different optimization functions.
Right.
Yeah, I can understand.
And even in the most extreme cases, the individuals who are participating, and often, again, the organizations who are participating, while they can align with collective objectives and goals, and they will perform much better if they also are achieving their own goals at the same time. And that's very important, especially for organizations who are just transitioning from more traditional hierarchical command and control types of situations to more of an ecosystem situation. And I come at this from a platform-based business perspective. And in platforms, especially when we're looking at transitions, say, from a traditional product company to a platform companies have different sides. So Uber has drivers and riders. Airbnb has hosts and guests. And platform companies need to make sure all the sides are meeting their own objectives. Whereas a product company often has customers and it's a more straight line approach. And then as long as you're making the customer happy with whatever you're providing to it, that's fine. But when you're dealing with a platform business, it tends to be a little more complex in terms of thinking about the different types of goals and making sure that they're all being met and that sometimes they can conflict and then you have tensions and then you have to resolve those tensions.
Gotcha. Fascinating.
So that's a long answer to your definition question.
Yeah, no, but it sort of expands the definition and now opens up the door to all of these implications. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the important implications of that. For example, I know that you look at, say, leadership. How does leadership need to change? You talk about the role of HR, that, when HR is often only looking at the 80,000 and the other 50,000 are being managed by procurement and finance. And what about like KPI setting and goal setting? Like what have you found to be some of maybe like the one or two or three most significant implications or adjustments that need to be made?
Yes. And I would say this varies greatly by geography because this varies a little bit by laws and regulations. I was thinking about because you mentioned performance management. So I'll just mention that for a moment and then we can go kind of back up to the larger question about, for example, leadership. There are laws that vary by countries, by region, sometimes could be by state in the United States, it could be by country often. So for example, in the United States, you can't do performance management or offer training and development specifically to contractors because you're then treating them like an employee and then they end up being considered an employee. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but it gives you a sense that as managers and leaders, one needs to understand what one can do or not do with a contingent workforce to allow them to develop.
Which is shocking because, I read an article recently in Harvard Business Review and it said the hourly workers, one of the things that they really value is development opportunities, feeling like you care about my development, my future. So that seems like a real missed opportunity.
And there are different ways to do it. So different organizations who build communities make training available to members of the community. We talk about an organization called Applause that has U-testers. They're a small organization, but they have a community worldwide of over 1 million testers, which is outstanding. And they allow any of the testers to take training on their website on their own, whether or not those testers are generating revenue for them. So I've signed up to be a U-tester, for example, because I wanted to understand how it worked. And you have access to all this. I recommend you check it out. So there are different ways to approach this. It's not quite so straightforward, but I think the point is that managers, especially in multinationals, where the laws vary, again, by region and by geography, need to be very careful what they're asking contractors specifically to do. The other thing I would say, which took me a while to get my head around, is that for bigger companies, when you're talking about 50,000 contingent workers, for example, they're not going out and hiring each of them individually. They may hire individual ones. They're not engaging individually. They have deals with large labor organizations, Manpower, Randstad, SourceRight, such as that. And they can make a phone call or send a note these days and say, we need 10,000 software developers. And they will get 10,000 software developers. And those developers may be employees of another company. So you may consider them a contractor. And so they are a contractor to you, but they may be an employee to somebody else. So then there's a whole set of questions about who does the performance management, who does the training, who does the compliance. And again, this has been going on for a very long time, right? The notion of temps is not a new notion. It's just that now the scale is different. How those contingent workers are being involved is different. The other thing I would say is we've been focused in this conversation thus far heavily on contingent workers and contractors because that is a big part of a workforce ecosystem. But as I said, we also have developers, and we took it one step further and said the actors who are external to the company, although they actually might be internal also, could also be technologies. So these days we're talking a lot about AI, machine learning, generative AI, automation, robots, chatbots, whichever version you'd like to talk about. And I know you've had many on your show who have talked about human AI collaboration and humans needing to learn how to work better with technologies. And we would say that while it's hard to say a technology itself is a worker or is an employee, I would say it is definitely part of a workforce ecosystem. And one of my favorite aha moments was when a person I was interviewing from NASA said, we give our software bots employee ID numbers. And again, I said, wait, what did you just say? Right? Wait, what was that? And he said, oh, yes, well, we have to give them employee ID numbers. And he laughed. He said, we don't give them badges, but they need access to data that's in our systems. And the only way to get access to that data is by having an employee ID number. Now, an IT person or someone may say, okay, that's just a systems thing. It's not real. It's not that big a deal. But I think it is a big deal in mindset and that he volunteered it. I didn't ask about it. The fact that he mentioned it means he is thinking about these technologies as contributing to their workforce. And so then someone will say, well, look, you don't do performance management. You don't do compensation. It's just not the same, right? And people have said that. And I'll say, well, do you do budgeting and resource allocation and figure out how much you want to allocate for these new technologies? Sounds a lot like compensation to me. Do you have metrics on how effective they are and how productive they are? Sounds a lot like performance management. So I think it's a very interesting question and useful, again, as one starts to think about what is a workforce, who or what is in a workforce, and how do we think about it from an ecosystem perspective to include these technologies. And the most forward-thinking people who we talk with are doing just that.
Wow. Oh my God, there are so many fascinating implications about this. And I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. Let's see, two areas I'd love if I could get your reaction to. One's around culture, one's around leadership. I was in a meeting yesterday and someone said, oh, you can't shift too heavily to these arm's length employees because then you can't control the culture. What have you found about culture?
Yes, so this is a great question. And we've found a lot of variability is the first thing I would say, which I think is really interesting. So I think the presumed answer is that you want a homogeneous culture. People think, oh, we need a consistent culture. Strong culture implies consistent culture, right? And I think what we're hearing more and more is you need to figure out what's most important in your culture. And it may be aligning around values, for example, aligning around mission, purpose, etc. And for some organizations, you do want a more consistent culture. In some organizations, it is better to have people really feel like they're part of the organization. In other organizations, and we have an example in the book that you can see, there may be many people involved who don't want to be part of the culture. And that's fine. They may say, look, if I wanted to really be a member of your team and have the t-shirt and come to the parties and really be involved, even have your benefits, then I would ask to be an employee. Or I'd go find someone else to be employed. What I really want is the flexibility. I want this to be transactional. You give me a task, I will do the task, I will give you outcomes, you will pay me, we will all be happy. And for many people, that's fine. And so I think it's important that leaders understand and get to know their various groups that are part of their workforce ecosystem and what's going to be an appropriate culture in their workforce ecosystem. And it may be different in different parts of the organization. I don't think it needs to be consistent in that way.
Interesting.
But I will say that it's absolutely new and different for leaders to be trying to build culture with a hugely diverse set of participants, and diverse not only in the traditional sense of diverse, but diverse in terms of work arrangements as well.
Right. Yeah. That brings a whole other dimension. Different types of people, different types of needs, but then different types of arrangements. So what are some of the other main implications in leadership, in addition to shaping culture, managing culture, whatever that is? What are some of the other big implications that leaders should be thinking about?
I think that this is, again, a great question that draws from the topic of culture, which is we've been talking about the challenges of leadership without authority for many years. Again, right? This is not a new topic, but when many of the people and entities that you're leading don't report to you, then the challenges around leading without authority become even more complex, even more challenging. Then there is much more, again, around lining around purpose, around mission, around values, and trying to figure out how can we get to this alignment, coordination that makes sense when you don't have the traditional levers of titles, promotions, perks, benefits, right?
Yeah, it's like as a leader, I would work on pulling out the carrot, but I always knew there was a stick there as well. And here you less often have the stick.
But I would even, as I'm sitting here chatting with you, I'm thinking, right? I mean, you're a leader, you're the leader of this podcast, right? And you have to convince those of us who are your guests to participate. Right. And so it's a similar type of a discussion, right? Where how do you say, look, this is good for you. This is good for us. It's good for our listeners. It's providing a service. What are the ways that we get people to perform and do things beyond a more traditional, I'm going to give you a job and I'm going to give you a title and I'm going to give you compensation monthly for X number of years, right? It's a just different way to think about how are we going to get work done and how are we going to get work done together in ways that are good for everybody and productive.
Yep. I see often this analogy of Hollywood brought up as an example. And what's interesting about the group of people that can come together to produce a movie and then disband is that there are roles. Like I know what an editor does and I can just pick between editors and they can jump in and know what to do. Do you see that sort of playing, kind of changing specialties or things like that, or on-ramping and up the learning curve? What do you see?
So I think, yes, that's a great example, right? So that's a workforce ecosystem. You pull together people with different areas of expertise, different roles. Together, they can create something and maybe disband. Maybe subsets of them tend to work together. I think they're all different business models on it. And in particular industries, that may work. Other industries, it may work differently. So I wouldn't say that is the model. I would say it's a model. And I think we need to just be careful that we understand that what is a workforce ecosystem particularly changes shape depending on the type of company and the type of industry. Again, we have been cautious in our research and in the book to try to include all different types. This morning, I was talking to a group of entrepreneurs. A startup environment where they might have a part-time CFO or even a part-time CEO. That's very different than a large organization that clearly has a full-time CEO and CFO. They both have workforce ecosystems. Which parts are external and which parts are internal may vary. And then how do those roles change? And yes, of course, there are huge implications for onboarding, for upskilling, for all of the topics. We didn't discuss here hybrid work, remote work. Often people immediately jump to those topics. Also an interesting question, right? If you have people working remotely, one's an employee and one's a contractor, what's the difference? Why are there differences? There are lots of reasons and answers to these questions, but it raises all kinds of questions. And the other quick thing I will mention, and I probably should have when you asked about leadership, is we haven't discussed anything about ethics or social responsibility. And the third part of our book, so one of my co-authors, David Kieran, has a PhD in philosophy and ethics. So he comes at this from a slightly different angle. That's been hugely helpful for us in thinking about this. Because, of course, this topic raises questions around ethics and social responsibilities and responsibilities of employees and employers and workers We could do a whole other podcast on that. But I didn't want to leave without saying that's another set of questions that we are very aware are super relevant to this topic.
And you explore them in your book and in your articles and work, a lot of it published at MIT Sloan Management Review. How else can people engage with you and continue learning from you?
So at Sloan Management Review, there's something called the Big Ideas Initiative. And under that, there's a project called the Future of the Workforce. And so far in the past 3 years, I think we just calculated we've published 10 different items, short articles, deep research reports, 2 infographics. And then most recently in April, we just released this book called Workforce Ecosystems, Reaching Strategic Goals with People, Partners, and Technologies. It's available on Amazon and everywhere else. If you go to the MIT Press site, it's available internationally as well. And it will be out on Kindle October 10th. So that's the best way. And I'm on LinkedIn. If you're really interested and you really want to get in touch, I'm always interested in talking to people who find this topic interesting.
Awesome. Well, Liz, thank you for the work you did for helping us piece apart what the implications of this evolving future is and for taking some time to share it with us. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It truly has been a pleasure and an honor, and I really appreciate it. And thanks for all your fabulous work in this area.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Nest, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kai-Han Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week with another episode of Outthinkers.